I have an important message for all of the RPG villains out there. Your mental health is important. You should take some time to tend to the few remaining fraying threads of sanity that you have. So, when those so-called heroes kick in the door to your lair and slay your henchmen, don't let them convince you that you shouldn't spend time monologuing. They're the ones who are being disrespectful to your house. Monologuing is cathartic. It's good for your state of mind. So when those uninvited guests try to switch things over to encounter mode, you drop that fear spell, you throw out that paralyzing poison, and you make use of a few good Tanglefoot bags to make sure that they spend time properly respecting the plan that you invested so much of your time and energy to create. It's the right thing to do. Today, we're going to talk about that weird intersection between social roleplay and encounter mode in RPGs on this episode of The Local Disaster Tour Guide. Hello travelers and tourists, my name is Mark and I am the Local Disaster Tour Guide. That's right, I am a storyteller who is ready for some witty back and forth banter. You go first. Welcome to a journey through the fantastic world of TTRPGs like Pathfinder and Starfinder. Today we are continuing my Storytelling in Pathfinder 2nd Edition series, where we take a look at the advice, the tips, the tricks, and tools that Paizo gives its game masters to help them run, well, Pathfinder 2nd Edition. This series is intended for every game master to be a part of the conversation, so whether you're a beginner or a veteran, or even if you're a storyteller from a completely different game system, I invite you to be a part of this conversation. All of us can grow as storytellers, and it's my hope that these conversations can help us improve our skills and tell better games. Today, we're going to be talking about social encounters, which is a strange beast inside of RPGs. It is a mixture of, well, social role-playing and encounter mode. We've been working our way through encounter mode, and so far in this series, we've described encounter mode as the most mechanically complex version of role-playing, where you are most focused on the mechanical details of how the game works, and where we seek to maintain a relatively high degree of tension about the outcome of a particular scene or encounter. And most of the time, when we talk about encounter mode play, we talk about fight scenes. That's kind of the natural fit for this particular style of play. Usually when we think of things like role-playing or social events, we don't imagine those as being broken up into initiative rounds. We don't imagine those as requiring so much of a heavy emphasis on rules and structure in order to make those scenes work. Oftentimes, these things are portrayed as being at the opposite ends of the spectrum inside of a particular game. However, there are rare occasions where adding some of the structure of encounter mode to a particular role-playing event can help highlight certain aspects of that situation and can help facilitate and improve the overall experience of resolving that scene or that challenge. Now, the information for today's video is being pulled, at least in part, from the Game Mastering section of the core rulebook, pages 494 to 496, and also from the Running Encounter section of the Game Mastery Guide, in particular page 16 of that book. So if you're interested in reading up more on these topics, I encourage you to check out those particular sections. There's plenty of great advice in those sections that you can make use of. And one last note before we dive too deep into this topic. This video and several of the videos that I will be posting on my long-form content days may be a little bit shorter than you're used to. I'll be honest, I just have a lot of doctor's appointments this month, and I even have a minor surgery that I have to get through. There's just a lot of things going on. So to balance the needs of my schedule, this video and some of the other videos that are coming out in the next few weeks may be a little bit shorter, but I do hope to spark a good conversation on these topics, because ultimately I believe it is the conversation that we have that helps us all to grow as storytellers. Let's get started. Now up front, let me go ahead and say what this video is not. This video is not a discussion of all role-playing. There are plenty of role-playing encounters, there are plenty of role-playing scenarios, there are plenty of moments of dialogue and interaction that have no need for the kind of structured play we associate with encounter mode. So those particular moments in your game, that's not the conversation that we're having today. Instead, we're looking at that narrow band of overlap between social and roleplay style encounters and what we actually deem encounter mode. Those moments where there is a heavy emphasis on the social aspect of play, but where the game still benefits from the kind of structure that makes encounter mode so fun. It doesn't happen all the time, but when it does happen, you want to be mindful of it because it can facilitate better gameplay. In my mind, I feel like there are 4 general areas or types of encounters where you can use this structured encountered play for resolving social scenarios. And while this list is probably not exhaustive, I think it serves as a good introduction to the kinds of scenarios where this particular form of play would happen. The first scenario is what I call the non-lethal duel. The second scenario is the standoff or the negotiation. The third scenario is the duel of wits or the debate. And the fourth scenario would be a trial or some other situation involving the legal maneuverings of a government. In each of these situations, there is a strong emphasis on the social aspect of play, but you still want to keep a structure to the scene so that you can facilitate that particular type of encounter. Now, the first and most obvious type of situation that mixes these two types of play would be the cinematic trope of the non-lethal duel. For a good example of this, there is a scene very early in the new Marvel movie Shang-Chi where there are 2 characters who are fighting one another, but they're not really trying to injure one another. Instead, they're doing things like feinting and tripping and shoving other characters into a pool of water in an effort to demonstrate their superior skill against their opponent without actually harming their opponent. This is a trope that occurs in a lot of books and a lot of movies. We see it quite frequently, and honestly, it can be a good storytelling tool. By the way, if you're interested in a good deep dive on these types of duels in cinema, let me strongly recommend the Sword Lady of YouTube, Jill Barrett. She does a lot of studying on the art of stage combat, and she does a lot of videos on famous examples of stage combat. And even though it's not strictly TTRPG material, I have learned a lot as a storyteller from watching her dissect different examples of stage combat for storytelling. So if you're interested in that content, I'll throw a link up here or maybe in the video description, and you can go check out some of the work she's done. But in non-lethal duel scenarios, you have a situation where you definitely have that structure of encounter mode play. There is an initiative count, and people are certainly taking offensive actions regularly inside of that. But the focus is not so much on harming someone or killing an opponent, but rather on achieving some kind of social victory over the opponent. Stepping up a level from that, you have the next scenario, which is the standoff or the negotiation. And a good example of this in cinema is the trope of the hostage negotiation. You have a situation where there are 2 sides who are certainly antagonistic towards one another, but rather than fighting it out, there's a standoff or a negotiation that's occurring, and you want to track where the participants are, what the participants are doing. They are certainly trying to get the advantage over one another, but they are not, at least right now, resorting to blows. In my video on bypassing and ending encounters, we actually talked about this as an option for the way that encounters can come to an end. There may be situations where you want to keep track of what everyone is doing, but you have switched from focusing on the combat side of play to the social aspects of that particular scene. Now, the next 2 scenarios I'm going to talk about, they step up a little bit further, and I'll go ahead and say that even though these are probably structured scenarios, they are probably not going to use true encounter mode play, because you probably would not divide these particular instances into 6-second chunks. But by the same token, you still want to keep track of who's had a turn to act, who's had a turn to do things, and you want to keep a sense of order and structure to the encounter so that it will flow well. Our third example is what I call the duel of wits or the debate, where you have two people who are fundamentally unlikely to actually engage in combat, but where you still want to keep track of who has acted, who's had a chance to speak or to do something, and have a sense of the order between all of the participants. In other words, a duel of wits isn't very much fun if only one person is talking. As a storyteller, you might still have a sense of structure. You might model that debate or that duel of wits in a manner similar to encounter mode play, but you're probably going to be stretching the rounds of that encounter out a little bit more than they would in true encounter mode, but still the structure is there. And for our last example, you have legal proceedings such as trial or a legislative accession of a government body. The time span of such events certainly doesn't match with encounter mode, but you might structure these events in a way very similar to encounter mode, with all of the participants having their opportunity to present or try to gain an advantage of some kind, with the hope of achieving whatever legal outcome they desire. All four of these scenarios can benefit from the structure of encounter mode style play, even if the emphasis is not on pure combat. So as a storyteller, if you're going to use social encounters, that kind of begs the question, what do you need to prepare for if you want to make these encounters interesting? And the first thing that we should talk about here is, as a storyteller, you should look at social encounters as an opportunity to handle initiative in unique ways, as an opportunity to bring unique actions into the game, and possibly even bring in unique reactions as well. Social encounters have the structure of encounter mode. The time scale may be different, but it still has a lot of the trappings of normal encounter mode. At a given point, a certain character is going to have the initiative, they're going to have the advantage, have the opportunity to act and affect this particular scene in whatever way they might desire. And as a storyteller, you're going to want to look for ways to mechanically represent the things that your players and their antagonists might choose to do in this particular moment. Now, one of the easiest ways to do this is through Pathfinder 2E's use of skill-based initiative. Characters who are skilled in things such as diplomacy or deception or society can gain an advantage and can get the first word in because of the incredible proficiency that they have with these various skills. This is actually an opportunity for you as a storyteller to reward players for focusing on skills that might be useful outside of combat and giving them a serious mechanical advantage for those skill investments. Also, by taking the time to create unique actions or reactions that your players can use in these scenarios, you can really add a layer of mechanical depth that will facilitate the story. I think the easiest example that I could cite here is in the Game Mastery Guide for Pathfinder 2E. In the NPC gallery, you can find a barrister, a lawyer basically, and one of their unique actions is the cite precedent action, which they can use during a trial to give their enemies a disadvantage and make it more likely that they will achieve the legal outcomes that they desire. Okay, I'll admit it, I just want to make objection a reaction in one of my games. But as a storyteller, if you're looking at doing social encounter mode style play, one of the things you want to do is ask yourself what mechanical elements, such as skill checks for initiative or unique actions and reactions, you can use to help add mechanical complexity to the scene to help facilitate that particular encounter. Now, the next thing that you want to think about if you're running a social encounter is statistics. And normally when we think about statistics, we think about, well, combat statistics. We think about hit points and armor class and attack bonuses and damage rolls. And, well, I hope you're not losing too much HP during that debate. That would be really awkward. However, even if we aren't using normal combat statistics when resolving social encounters, there are going to be certain statistics that will be relevant, and as a storyteller, we want to be aware of those things when we're planning out the encounter so that we're ready to adjudicate whatever mechanical issues pop up during play. If you're running Pathfinder 2e, this means you want to take a look at several important stats that your NPCs might have. Some of the important stats are going to include things such as their social skills, their perception, and their will DC. It's worth noting in Pathfinder 2e, if you need a quick and dirty what's the difficulty class of this social skill check, usually the target creature's will DC is the easiest number that you can throw out. You can adjust that number up and down, but if you need something quick, a will DC works wonders in this game. Noting those things ahead of time will help you make rolls and calculate outcomes very quickly. Now, what are some of the skills you might want to pay attention to when you're planning social encounters for your game? Now, this is hardly an exhaustive list, but if you're playing Pathfinder 2nd Edition, here are some of the skills that you're probably going to want to pay attention to. Deception gives you access to the lie activity, and intimidation gives you access to the coerce activity. Diplomacy is a powerhouse in social situations, and it gives you access to gather information, make a request, and make an impression. The society skill can allow your character to attempt a forgery, and society, along with basically every lore skill in the game, could become important if you need to make a recall knowledge check. Finally, one of the things I've noticed from reading through several of the NPCs in the Game Mastery Guide is that a lot of them make use of the performance skill for special actions and reactions that they might use in particular social contexts. So, if you're trying to add some unique actions and reactions like we talked about earlier, tying those to the performance skill does have some precedent inside of Pathfinder 2e's rules. Of course, one of the trickiest things about running a social encounter in a game is, well, the victory conditions. In a fight scene, your opponent's hit point total serves as a pretty clean victory condition. If their hit point total hits 0, you win! Social scenes don't have that same clarity, and that means as a storyteller that you want to spend some time thinking about what the victory condition for your players might be. Now, this might be a blessing or it might be a curse depending on your particular viewpoint, but Pathfinder 2nd Edition actually offers us a couple of different options in this area. One is tracking NPC attitudes, and the other is the victory point system from the Game Mastery Guide. And as a storyteller, you might use one or the other, or you might combine them in order to create a unique victory condition for your players. A small sidebar discussing the NPC attitude scale can be found on page 246 of the Pathfinder 2e core rulebook, and it includes such conditions as hostile, friendly, or helpful. The idea is that through successful skill checks, your players can improve the attitude of particular NPCs, and as a storyteller, you might decide that if your players can make this particular NPC helpful, or make 2 or 3 different NPCs friendly, that would be enough for the players to overcome the obstacle in that moment and advance to the next portion of the story. For an example of this, imagine the trial scenario that we discussed earlier. One of your PCs is on trial, and their legal future is at stake. Your PC's goal might be to raise as many of the jurors for that trial up to friendly or better in attitude in order to determine the final legal outcome. The other option comes from the Game Mastery Guide starting on page 148, and it's called Victory Points. In this particular instance, you as a storyteller would create a scale of, well, victory points. And victory points is a deliberately generic terminology that Paizo uses. You can turn victory points into literally anything that you desire. One of the examples, just a few pages later, is influence. The idea simply is, in order for your players to achieve victory, they must garner a particular number of victory points, or maybe influence in this instance, and if they get enough victory points or influence, they are allowed to proceed. However, in many victory point scenarios, there will be an antagonist who is also trying to achieve victory points, and it becomes a contest of skills where you try to see if the players can gather enough victory points before their opponent does. Whoever crosses the appropriate threshold first, they are the ones who win. As a storyteller, either of these two options can work. NPC attitude is often good for situations that you hope to resolve fairly quickly, whereas victory points can be good for situations where players might need to put in a lot of effort over a period of time in order to achieve success. But the main idea is this: you as a storyteller need to decide, this is how I want my players to achieve success, this is what success looks like mechanically, and this is how I'm going to structure the skill rolls and the outcomes of the scenario using the rules of Pathfinder 2e or whatever other game you might be playing. Decide the victory conditions before the encounter begins, and then your players will have a clear goal that they are working towards. But the time has come for me to turn the conversation over to you. What are your thoughts on social encounters? This mixture between a social and role-playing style of game and structured encounter mode forms of play. Do you use this structured form of role-playing very often? And if so, what advice or tips would you offer other storytellers who want to bring these types of encounters into their games? Are there scenarios for this type of play that I didn't think of? Are there stats or skills that might be useful in these encounters that I failed to bring up? Leave your thoughts in the comments down below, and if you would like me to dive a little bit deeper on this subject in the future, let me know that as well. Also, don't forget to do all the YouTube stuff. If you enjoyed the video, leave a like or share it. I strongly encourage you to be a part of the conversation, and if you would like to be more involved with the Disaster Tour Guide community, you can check out my Discord or my Patreon, which are linked in the video description. Thank you so much for being a part of the conversation, and have a wonderful day.